Hello and welcome to part 3 of this unitycookie.com tutorial, and in this video we're going to be looking at working with properties. Now shaders are a little bit boring at the moment, so we need to create a properties block so that we can give it some inputs. So at the moment it's just grey, there's nothing we can do about it. So for this one in Model Develop, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab lesson 2, I'm going to press Ctrl D and just duplicate that. It'll process for a minute, and as you can see it's automatically named it lesson 3 for me. How nice of Unity. Okay, so let's open this up. So this is where we left off. I'm just going to close out those other ones, and let's add in some properties. So properties, what are properties? Now properties are anything that you want to have adjustable parameters for, such as images, slider values, and color pickers. Now this saves us having to go into the shader every time we want to adjust something. So we could put in a little slider to adjust that albedo if we want. Of course we're not going to do that, we're going to add in an image texture, but you get the idea. Okay, so properties go before the sub shader. So they go within the shader little block itself. So in here we're going to write properties with a capital P. Now it's still black, so I know that I spelled that wrong. And put in an ER there, and now it becomes blue, so it's spelled right. And let's take a look at a few different properties that we can write. The first one is a texture. So I'm just going to write main text, texture. I'll explain what these mean in a second. Okay, so this is a property. So we've defined a few things here. Let's break this down a little. So we have variable name, and within this we have the display name, so what it displays in Unity. We have the type, and we have equals starting value. So for this one up here, we can see we have named this underscore main text, or main text. You'll notice a lot of properties in Unity always start with an underscore. It's a good habit to get into. It's just sort of the standard. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure why, but we just start with them with underscores. It does help when getting into UV coordinates, just keeping things a little bit separate. Okay, so within here, the display name, I've decided to call this texture. So we could decide to call this diffuse texture. This is a 2D texture, which means it is a flat image with X and Y coordinates. And it is white. So we want to start off as a white image. So let's see what else we can put in here. Let's put in bump text. I'm going to call this one here normal map, because we want to create a normal map. This is still a 2D texture, but a difference. So the only difference between these two shaders is I'm going to give it a bump starting value. So this means if you haven't got anything in it, it won't put any bump to the mesh. Whereas if you put white, it'll put bump over the entire mesh, and that's just not pretty. So that one there we use for normal maps. Let's create a color picker. So let's write in here color tint, if we want to tint our color. Let's call this here color tint. as before, we can call it whatever we want. The type is going to be a color. And this one here equals 1111. So we want it to be RGB alpha all 1. Okay, that's cool, but what else can we do? We can do some more things. Let's go tint value. So how strong is that tint? Let's call this one here tint intensity. And this one is going to be a range between 0.0 and 1.0, which means it's going to be a float. If we put 0 and 1, it means we can only go in increments of 1. 0.0 and 1.0 gives us a nice float. And let's create a starting value of 0.4. That's good. Okay, what else can we do? Let's do a darkness. So, how dark is our shader? Remember, all these variable names mean nothing, it's just what we refer to them as within the shader itself. This is going to be a float equals 0.25. Notice how I don't have to end these properties with semicolons. Alright, let's create another one. Coord. Let's create a vector coordinate. So I'm going to call this vector coord, and this is going to be a vector. Okay, and this one here, I'm going to put in the XYZ coordinates. And the last one that we can do is called a cube map. So this is a special one which is used for reflections. Cube map. Cube. So cube is its own type. And we put 2 speech marks in here. So we're not giving it a starting value, which is empty, which is fine. And then our curly brackets. So these are the different property types that we can use. If we jump into Unity, you can see that it's all come through alright. And if we just select our robot, make sure that we have it saved as something else. So let's go call this one here diffuse texture. Alright, and that there's just so that we can come in and find it. And once we pick that, let's take in the other one. Oh, I already have a diffuse texture. Ha! Just a moment, I'll so you can see in Unity, because we have lesson 1 was also called diffuse texture, I'm just going to call this one here diffuse example. What's that? Okay, so we have diffuse example, and we have diffuse texture. Unity cookie, diffuse texture. There we go. Okay, and now we have a whole bunch of parameters and stuff that we can put in this. Now, there is one error in this. So you can see it's already loaded in our diffuse and normal map. Unity is quite smart to do that. And we've got our color tint, our little color picker, a little slider that we can move around, a little darkness input box. So I actually quite like these inputs over sliders, but doesn't give you a limit. vector coords. This is where my mistake is. I put in X, Y, Z. I forgot the W. So for that one there, we put in a fourth vector for W, and that'll load that in there. Alright, and we have our cube map. Okay, so that is all of the properties that we can use in our shaders. Now there is more properties than this. These are the ones that you're going to be using the most. I don't actually think there's that many more properties, but yeah, we'll get into more of that later. So now that we have got all of them inside our shader, we want to define them. Now we define our properties within the sub-shader. So you'll often see these underneath the struct input, but you can actually place these wherever you want. You can come place them underneath anywhere underneath cgprogram is fine. So in here, we can write in whatever we want really. So which one should we do? Let's just start out with a sampler 2D. I'm going to get to this in a moment when we start writing up our textures and such. But just to give you a couple of examples, sampler 2D, UV underscore, oh, nope, I'm talking about structs. My mistake. We want sampler 2D main text. Cool. So what that one there, it samples that image so that we can use it down here in this surface. Another one that we'll see is we can see float 4 color tint. And you might see a few other ones such as half rim, you can see fixed 4 underscore chord. There's a few different things, but these are the few that I want to discuss with you just briefly. There is these three. There is float, half, and fixed. Now float, this tells Unity that the property uses for this one, this float here, it's going to use 4 floating point digits, so 4 floating point values, and this is most common for the RGB alpha values such as the color picker, but it's also the most computationally expensive. The half is less so, and the fixed is the least. But it's not a lot more processing power, and it gives us a lot more flexibility. So we use fixed when we are calling things down here. So down here, if I was to have a fixed for text 2D, then that is fine because we're not doing anything else with that texture. So fixed are good. You're probably wondering why we don't just use fixed everywhere and why we're still using floats. But yeah, floats are just easier to work with. It's not that big of a performance hit. Okay, so we're going to talk probably about that at a later stage. If you've got any questions about float versus fixed versus half, feel free to leave a comment and I can talk to you about that further. Alright, so now that we've got this, let's go ahead and write something up. So let's just get rid of those. Get rid of that struct input as well because we're going to replace that. And we get rid of all of these but the first one. So we're going to write this main text. It's going to be diffuse texture 2D white. So we've already explained what that is. It's going to be a 2D texture. So a diffuse texture. And with that there, we won't have any more in this one. We'll just stick with one property at the moment. We'll get into using other properties in a moment. So let's come into our struct input. And to handle this main text, we need to grab the UVs. So we need to tell Unity how we're going to place this image. So what we're going to do is we're going to write in float2. Float2 means we're getting 2 floating point digits, so this will be u and v. So effectively x and y, u and v, sort of which coordinates it's going to grab. And it's going to be uv underscore main text. So we're going to get main text. Make sure we put a semicolon at the end. We're going to grab main text and we're going to put the UV coordinates onto it. So that's the first UV coordinates. Now I'm going to make a little note here. We'll get into this at a later date, but when you're working with multiple UV coordinates, because this one here got me stuck for a while when I first started learning shaders, is you can put in UV2. And this is going to source the second UV map. So if you're using a light map, I'd recommend using your main UV map and a light map, or a main UV map and a tiled image light map. And yeah, so we're grabbing the first UVs and we'll call them UV main text. So yeah. Okay, so with that there done, we can now sample it. So let's write in that sampler. Sampler 2D underscore main text. So we want to sample our image so that we can use it and make sure it's, ready for us to use. And now we can come down here and we can use it. So I'm going to use shorthand here. I'm going to write text 2D, which means we're going to process this is the function to process a 2D image. So as it's a function, we're going to give it some values. And the first value is our texture, which is going to be main text. And then the second value is going to be in.uv underscore main text. So this in is referring to this in up here. So we're grabbing the input from our struct and we're mapping it to in, and then down here we're writing in and we're taking UV main text from in. So UV main text from in, which is from input, which is up here. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And then after we have mapped this image to that UV coordinate, so we've grabbed UV and we've mapped it to be UV main text. Now we are mapping that UV main text to the main text here, so the main image. And we're sampling it through this text 2D. So we've got all the sample now, it's all set up and ready. All we need to do is grab the RGB values from it. And let's save that, jump into Unity, let that load up and hope it doesn't go pink. And it hasn't. Fantastic. So we now have a diffuse color applied to our model, as you can see, which is looking fantastic. So we can now see the texture on them. Which you can see up there, you can select whichever one you want. So I could put in the normal if I wanted. Now the normal is, of course, in normal map is going to look a little weird. It's actually mapped the normals. Unity's a smart little program. But you can see if we put on like the wrong image, we get this sort of thing happening. We can change this image. Oops, there goes my pen. Effectively is what I'm saying. And yeah, that's looking fantastic. So let's jump back into MonoDevelop and make sure that we've got this all broken down and you understand what's happening here. So of course, the ones we've added is main text. This comes into the properties box. And the main text, we're assigning a diffuse texture. So we're calling it diffuse texture, and we're going to refer to it as main text. The type is a 2D texture, so it's not a cube map or anything, it's a 2D texture. And it is white. So the white just means that's the default value if we haven't assigned anything to it. New one down here, float to UV main text. So in this input, we are going to grab the UV, so the first UV map, and we're going to assign it to a variable called UV underscore main text. So you could write this as UV main like this, and what that will do is make it black, which means it hasn't worked. And yeah, we just need it to have it assigned to this one up here. It's kind of a little bit confusing, but there we go. It's, yeah, you need to have UV main text. Okay, so the next one is sampler 2D. Now, sampler 2D is effectively, we're going to sample our image. We're going to make sure it's all sweet for us to use down here. And down here, we'll have this text 2D function, which takes our UVs from the in UVs, which is up here, and we assign them to our main text, which was sampled here and we've placed up here. And that's it. It's really no more complex than that. So let's make this a little more complicated. What I want to do is I want to have a multiplier. So let's create a new one, and I'm just going to call this darkness. So this is going to make the model more black, effectively. This one here, I'm just going to write darkness. This one here is going to be a range between 0.0 and 1.0, and the default is going to be 1. So we want to have no darkness to start off with, which is going to be 1. It would probably make more sense to have 0 now that I think about it. So 0 darkness is going to be no black applied. And what we're going to do is we're going to multiply. Actually, before we do that, we'll have to, of course, define it down here. So we come in and we're going to go float darkness, and that's just telling it it's a float. RGB times underscore darkness. Let's save that. Jump into Unity. And it's given us an error at line 4, which means we can come in here and we can see, what error have we made? So I've got a range. We have that. Okay, so the problem is I had a semicolon. Now you don't put semicolons in the properties box. So that was my mistake there. So make sure that doesn't have a semicolon, then we'll open it up in Unity. And what do you know? Darkness of 0 means it's black, darkness of 1 means it's, normal. But what if we want this the other way around? Well, what we can do is we can just put this darkness into its own little box, and we can go 1 minus. So we're just negating it effectively. So that goes 0 to 1. We're going to go 1 to we're going to minus it from 1, which is effectively inverting it. Alright, so darkness of 1 makes it dark. And that is it for this lesson. So hopefully that all makes sense. And what we can do now is we can jump into normal mapping.